Morning, everybody. We're just waiting for the last few attendees to come in from the lobby, and then we'll get going. Good morning and welcome to Strategy Café, everybody. It's time for your shot of early morning leadership inspiration. Thanks to everyone that signed up. It's wonderful to have you on board. I hope it's going to be an informative and useful session. For those that don't know me, I'm David. I'm Head of Marketing and a Strategy Facilitator at Alembic. This is my first time presenting Strategy Café, and what better way to start than on the topic of leadership communication. I'm going to stick my neck out here early, folks, and state that I'm not an expert at communicating. I don't mind admitting that. If I could find an L plate, I'd be wearing it. That said, I'm competent and I'm going to hold this session together and lead you through for what's going to be a great start to Thursday. I'm pleased to be joined by some of the Alembic team today. So if you wouldn't mind, guys, just introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Nick. Hopefully you all know me by now, but I'm the founder of Alembic Strategy and lead on coaching and on strategy facilitation.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Rosanna. I'm a strategy facilitator. Great to see you all on here, and I just hope everybody enjoys today's Strategy Cafe.
Yeah, morning, I'm Matt. I'm another one of Alembic's strategy facilitators, and good to see everyone here this morning.
Thanks, guys. Our regular Strategy Cafe audience will be aware that we've been running the Coping in a Crisis theme since the lockdown began back in March. So as we begin to emerge from the pandemic and thankfully work towards recovery, this is going to be the final instalment in that series. All of the webinars are available on our YouTube channel, and you can find the link to that at the bottom of each page on our website. And on the Strategy Cafe Get Involved page itself. We also send out emails and things, so you should be able to find your way to those nice and easily. So please share them if you know somebody that might be interested in any of the topics that we've covered. We'll get something out to you that highlights exactly what we've done in the past. So just a quick heads up on Strategy Cafe. The next one sees the format revert to the regular routine with Nick at the helm, with guests rather than us, the Alembic team, sitting in. I'll give you more details about that towards the end. But there'll be a page on the website that will give you some information as well after this, so keep a lookout. So on to today. The plan is to finish by around 9:45, but we'll stay open at the end if anybody wants to stick around and ask us questions. It seems to be quite popular at the moment, so I'm quite happy to do that. But without any further delay, I'm going to push on. So to get things started on the topic of communication, I'm going to kick off with some examples of good and bad. So first up, the bad. Some of you might have heard this tale before, but it really demonstrates how a speaker's choice of language can mislead a listener. So in April 1951, during the Korean War, some 650 soldiers and officers from the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment were deployed to the most important crossing on the Imjin River. Their objective was to block the traditional invasion route to Seoul. The Chinese had sent an entire division of some 10,000 men against the isolated Gloucesters in a major offensive to take the whole Korean peninsula. Eventually, the small force was gradually surrounded and overwhelmed. And after 2 days of fighting, an American from the United Nations contingent, a Major General Robert H. Sewell, asked the British Brigadier, Thomas Brodie, how are the Gloucesters doing? A simple enough question, but the response from the Brigadier was with typical English understatement, and he said, a bit sticky. things are a bit sticky down here. So you can imagine, to American ears, this didn't sound particularly desperate. In fact, it sounds perfectly manageable. So the US General ordered them to just stand fast and tough it out. But the British troop quickly became overrun by the Chinese and sadly reduced their number from 650 down to about 150. So you can see that the surviving Gloucesters had to be eventually rescued by a column of tanks. Quite a tragic tale, but it does demonstrate the importance of the language that we use. Language matters. I think that's the point that we're making here. And so whilst we can't liken a battlefield scenario to business in this way, but there is some synergy between the language that's used. So we're now going to move on to an example of good communication. Now, I'm sure everybody knows this chap. Steve was legendary for his presentational style, pretty much the go-to guy for slick and punchy comms. He had an amazing ability to speak with passion and make his groundbreaking technology understandable and memorable and accessible through storytelling and its demonstration. And he typically did this by focusing on one idea at a time to hold the attention of the audience to a single point. And he did so with great attention, not only to his words, but his voice and surroundings. And his choice of clothes was nearly always jeans and a plain black round neck jumper. There was a consistency to that. This was so that he didn't detract attention from the product that he was attempting to draw focus to. And he spent so much time perfecting his masterful storytelling that he developed a style that could build an audience expectation in a way which only a few can emulate now. And through the use of very clear and simple words, messaging, he could communicate product topics with an ease that belied their complexity. So I'd be interested to know if any of our audience have spent time perfecting their own presentational style, and how aware of it are you? Is it something that you've considered and are actually conscious of? For those that aren't familiar with the system, you can throw in your questions via the chat box in the control panel there, and we'll pick these up and attempt to get to them throughout the course of the session. So just jumping back to Steve, he lived by the principle that we think our company will be the best possible company if every single person working here understands the whole master plan and can use that as a yardstick to measure decisions against. We think all our decisions will be made better if all people know that. He was very clear about his communications. So we talked specifically about decision making in the previous webinar, but within the context of communication, being able to connect with clarity across an aligned organization will undoubtedly give you an advantage in your business. So I'm going to throw this one out to the team. How can really good communication be used to an advantage in an organization? I know Rosanna wants to kick off with a response to this one.
Yeah, I think the point here is about where the responsibility of communication lies. And, you know, Steve Jobs is a really good example of this, because he saw it as his responsibility to communicate the vision and the purpose of the organization to every single employee. And so in your example of poor communication, it's interesting because I guess it poses the question, did that brigadier see it as his responsibility to actually communicate the gravity and the severity of what was going on? And so I think the key point is around, actually, if you want to be understood, that responsibility lies with you in how you're communicating, not how the other person receives it. So even if you think you're doing a really good job of communicating and articulating, it's meaningless if the other person hasn't understood for whatever reason, and that responsibility always sits with you and the message you're trying to get through. And I think Steve Jobs is just a fantastic example of, you know, really owning that responsibility.
For sure. Consider your audience. Nick?
Yeah, I agree. And I think to the audience out there, maybe piling with your comments or questions in the questions area for us, and we can pick them up as we go along. But it's self-evident from the two contrasting contributions from David that like we have one epic example of maybe good, but if this was easy, everyone would have it right and there wouldn't be any problems. So really, from a leadership perspective, I think communication is at the heart of everything. It's your job as a leader to understand how to influence the people around you, and so therefore you need to understand what impact you're having on people emotionally. And it's so complicated, isn't it? Because we can get confused about words. It can depend on how you feel about the person speaking, whether you trust them, whether you don't trust them. Other things going on in your life, maybe just how you're feeling right now, whether you're nervous, whether you're confident already, and even whether you're kind of in listening mode or not. So my key point here is that you definitely, picking up on Rosanna's comment, you need feedback, because actually understanding how your message is being received is the most important thing, and getting that right is something we all have to work on. Presumably Steve Jobs worked on that. I imagine he wasn't perfect from day one and worked hard on it.
Can I just add in there?
For sure.
I think that's a really important point about feedback, and I think we'll all resonate with the sense of I'm not sure they've understood me, and now it's hard to calibrate that, and sometimes that can feel awkward, and so do I have the confidence to check their understanding? That might feel a bit uncomfortable, but I was just going to share, because Nick's taught me a lot over the years, and one of the way that he explains sort of quite complicated, more complex things to me is that he'll explain it and then ask me to retell it back. And whilst at times that quite annoying sometimes, but actually it really helps me understand, but it also gives Nick the confidence that I have either got it right or not right, and that's the feedback. But it also, as the recipient of that information, helps me have the confidence that I've understood. So it's the feedback is important for both parties, and so I think that's just a really nice way of just checking the understanding with the other person.
Confirmation to check information's registered, for sure. Matt, go for it.
Yeah, I absolutely I agree with that. I think it's really important to be able to take note of different communication styles. Everybody communicates in a slightly different way, and not all of those styles are going to be perfectly compatible. So when you're working with people, particularly people who you haven't been working with for a very long time, it's important to take note where you might see a communication style which is more closed off, for example, so you can work to adapt your style to work better with anybody who's not a naturally good fit with you. And the Alembic team's perfect example, a breadth of people with lots of different communication styles. Everybody communicates differently. Yeah,
you've really got to take stock of all the different needs that the individuals have in your organization, and I wonder how many of our audience in their businesses work towards doing that. Are they conscious of it, and do they put effort into it? Because it certainly really rewards. We're going to move on, guys, on to the next slide. Thank you for your contributions there. So let's look at the definition of the word communication here. A very quick Google search suggests it means the imparting or exchanging of information by speaking, writing, or using some other medium. I mean, come on, we all do it all the time. It's easy, right? I mean, what's the big deal about talking? Why is it so important? Well, it's important because there's more than just you in the equation. There are others. I believe it was Ernest Hemingway that said, when people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen, and that's so true. Now, I'm not suggesting that the whole problem with communication lies with the listener, but it is an aspect that cannot be controlled by the speaker, the communicator. And we'll look at the complexity between speaker and listener on the next slide in a bit more detail. But how does the need for communication change when we add the word leader into the mix? The level of responsibility held by the leader ramps up the significance of communication. Whether it's words spoken or an email written or a picture taken, what about the choice of language and the level of detail, or the way you speak? What part do these play in your communication? I feel the key thing to remember here is that it's a two-way street. So we'll move on to the two-way street. The act of communicating usually requires more than one person. I mean, unless you're talking to yourself, especially if you're speaking, you'll probably have a listener. Maybe there's more than one listener. Maybe there's hundreds or even thousands hanging on to every single word that you say. But whether there's one or 1,000, this is where the challenge begins, because unscrambling your thoughts into a cohesive and simple message is a fundamental requirement of those in leadership roles. The ability to take information, whether it's a set of instructions or an update or a simple exchange with somebody, you've got to convert it into language and then send it to the listener. And this is where the skill lies. No matter how simple the information might seem to you, somewhere between the speaker and the listener, the risk of misinterpretation exists. Note to Brigadier. The scope for translation of your thinking, intentions, or objectives can be so easily skewed through the use of the wrong vocabulary. I've got personal experience of this. I'm sure many of our listeners do. In fact, if I'd had £1 for every single time I'd misinterpreted Mrs. Gray's instructions, I'd be broadcasting this webinar from my yacht in the Bahamas. And we're all prone to it. So I'm going to throw this again out to the listeners to contribute their experience of misunderstanding, and hopefully we can get some of those shortly. This is a great quote from someone I know the Alembic team have read pretty extensively. Once you have a strategy, you have to get there through your people. You have to listen, communicate, persuade, inspire, all of which are emotional intelligence skills. So let's look at the role of emotional intelligence in communication. We've all heard of IQ, intelligence quotient, but what about EI? It's becoming much more popular, I know. EI is emotional intelligence. So whilst IQ is designed to measure intellectual intelligence, indicating cognitive abilities like learning and understanding, EI measures our ability to identify and manage emotions, both in ourselves and in others. And for anybody that's interested, we quite frequently reference Lisa Feldman's book on emotions. Ask us if you're interested. EI is central to the ability to motivate others, and it starts with self-awareness and extends out to social awareness. And with self-awareness, we're more able to tap into our own intrinsic motivation, recognize the same traits in others around us. There are studies which indicate motivated people are much more adaptable, that they're better in the workplace when it comes to change, for example, and have generally more positive attitude to work and life. And motivated staff help to do things like spread your organization's reputation or reduce rates of absenteeism, improve their performance and the team around them's profit. They also tend to work harder to achieve their own goals and have a greater sense of urgency than non-motivated people. So with these obvious benefits in mind, it's pretty clear that employers are equally responsible for their team's motivation levels. In creating an environment that helps them to become more intrinsically motivated, both the employees and the organisation can get obvious rewards from that. So I'm going to put this one again out to the team. How might one go about motivating their people through communication? Who wants to kick that one off?
I'll go.
Any takers?
Yeah, I'll go. I think the key to motivation is about actually that we're not all motivated by the same thing. And so if you're wanting to motivate somebody, you have to go and find out what that is. And I think that's the start point. So you have to know what motivates them just by asking and observing, to Matt's previous point. But there's also subtle things you can do. So mirroring their language is quite a nice way of influencing them and motivating them. And I guess it's about helping them feel heard as well as being communicated to. So I think it's about understanding their key drivers, what's going to motivate this person, and don't assume that that's probably how you would want to receive it, and that take everybody as an individual. But mirroring is quite a good way of also motivating people, so mirroring their language, mirroring their style, mirroring their, their body language as well.
Yeah, great.
Pick up on it. So it's all really important stuff. It's a great question in from Mike Johnston. Hi, Mike. Nice to have you on the webinar this morning. Really lovely to see you. Hope you're good. He's sort of picking up on the fact that, when you have got time to do formal communication, there's no excuse for not preparing, right? But then, we often talk about moments of leadership. So the real challenge of leadership is when something comes at you unexpected. So, a classic forum for that might be just in the corridor or just in a meeting somewhere. It might also just be in a formal communication session where you get a question in and it's slightly left field, and you've got to just catch it on the rise. And I think that's just a really big challenge. So adding on to Rosanna's point of view, I think being ready to handle the key topics all times is also a compelling need for leaders, a little bit beyond the sort of the classic, simple kind of key ideas that you're communicating around. I think also being ready to handle other ones. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to think around the topics and to exercise our intelligence to think about them from different directions. I think that can be hugely valuable in terms of having a senior council or board around you to hear different perspectives, to pick up on feedback that's coming up and see what people are saying about things so you can respond to them. So there should be like a constant feedback loop, I think, and from a leader's perspective, you should be thinking about that a lot and preparing yourself. I'm a strong believer in key messages, and I think that can be super helpful. So having some simple, milestones or waypoints or key ideas about where we're going right now, which that simplicity is always really helpful. And keeping the message super simple is always really helpful for the big set pieces. And you can obviously go in more detail when you meet people one-on-one, so that can be useful. And then my final point would be to really think about core values, because I think if you can work out what your authentic values are and start to consciously use those as reference points for how you will handle things, your purpose may be the same, but your values will change the way you respond to it. And I think that speaks to communication. It's about how we will tackle it rather than what we're doing specifically, which often is where the communication needs to be clearer. It's, you don't really agree with where we're headed, but I don't like the way you're doing it is, often what's the issue. So having your values really clear and having them shared so that people know them, it gives you a reference point. You can say, look, we know that our core value is so and so. So as you'd expect, in this case, this is what we're going to do. And just keeping that reference point for sort of key principles of communication or key principles of your organization can really help when you get tackled with something unexpected, because either it'll come in and it's within your values or it's not. So you can kind of take it that way. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about preparation there, Nick. I think it's important not to take it for granted that communication and emotional intelligence just comes to everybody. It doesn't. It comes in varying degrees, and it is something like everything else that is good to practice. I mean, emotional intelligence in particular comes in a huge range to different people, and people continue to improve throughout their life. It's interesting. It's governed in the last part of your brain, which becomes anatomically mature. So it's the slowest thing which will come naturally to you. So it makes it especially important to continue to get feedback on how you're communicating, your emotional intelligence with people, and make sure it's something you practice throughout your career.
Yeah, great point there, Matt. I think all of this brings about a need for consistency and trust. Talking about values, I think what teams are looking for from leaders is a consistency of messaging, and the fact that they can have trust that they're being led in the right way. And you risk that through inconsistency. Nick, you've got something to add?
Yeah, I think David Hill has just picked up on this. Hi, David. Nice to have you on board. Just to make the point about that specific point, and I think so he's referencing in his question about the initial COVID communication, which was quite straightforward and quite simple. And I guess, to be fair to the government, the situation was clearer at that point. So it is harder at this point, because really it's up to us, it's up to the entrepreneurs to invent the way out. It's not really up to the government anymore. They just need to get behind us and support us, but it's up to us to make business come back. So super challenging. But I think the point he makes, which really stands out for me, is that what you say has to be backed up with what you do, to your trust point. And I think that is a big issue for the government right now, because a lot of what they say doesn't feel backed up by what they've done. So there's like clear question marks over the authenticity of it. And I think that as soon as you get that kind of chink in the armor on communication, people don't believe what you're saying anymore, because they're following what you do. And obviously that seems more authentic than your words, always. So that's a big point, I think, about being consistent with words and actions, taking it that way.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, David. I'm going to crack on. I'm going to talk about the power of non-verbal communication. So this is quite an old study carried out in California, I believe, in the 70s by Dr. Albert Mehrabian, who discovered the power of non-verbal communication. And he came up with a theory known as Mehrabian's communication theory, or some of you might have heard of it as the 7-38-55 model. He found that the influence of non-verbal communication is stronger than was first assumed, and he developed this model which demonstrated that only 7% of what we communicate consists of literal content of the message. The use of one's voice, such as tone, intonation, and volume, take up about 38%. And as much as 55% of our communication consists of body language. I mean, how does that work when we're all sat in little windows in webinars in today's world? Because we're communicating from the shoulders and above. But I do suggest we consider it when communication is critical, because it's a really good checkpoint. How can it be explained that a person only really listens to 7% of the substantive message? Well, Mehrabian argues that it's an inbuilt natural instinct, and the first human had an undeveloped voice and was dependent on non-verbal communication and the utterance of sound. Mehrabian states that the non-verbal communication is deeply rooted in the brain and responsible for reverting to this way of communicating almost instinctively. So we're just going to look at what each element means. So the word spoken, this is actually what's coming out of your mouth, what's being said as part of the verbal communication element here. And then the intonation is the vocal factor. So it's how you actually communicate through the tone of your voice, because that can have a profound effect. I mean, if you think about the different examples of that, I'm not going to do, because that would be strange. And then there's the body language. So which posture you adopt. How many of us actually think about the posture that we adopt when we're speaking? So again, I'm going to put this one back out to the team. I don't know whether you guys have got any comments on this one.
Well, I'm sort of just mildly laughing to myself, because I've had to dog sit my sister's dog this week, and so the instructions, I was like, so what's the instruction for like off? Is it off or is it down? I'm not a dog owner. And she said, well, it doesn't actually really matter. She'll just know by the way you say it. So I think this is like quite a cool point, because actually if you just point and say anything with the tone of you're going outside or in your pen or whatever it is, the dog knows what to do. And I just thought it was quite a nice example of how the tone of the way you speak, it is from our animalistic you know, it's that instinct, and we're so much more receptive to tone than and there's so much research about it. So you say, Nick, you were probably better placed to say the research, but just the way things are said, you can get so much meaning about a story just from the tone. So I just thought it'd be I was just finding it funny. I'm
going to pick up on this one because as a leadership consultancy, a lot of our business turnaround work is fundamentally rooted in clear communications at the highest level. So you complicated way of saying it, you resolve problems in senior people's business relationship and trust by getting alignment about a future plan that they all want to achieve together. So it's a sort of a relationship fix play, if you like, but a simpler way of putting it is that it's all in the communication. So you know, in many clients where at the top table there are, you know, problems that have risen over the years, the channels of communication are just blocked. And so a fundamental piece of work for us to do is to open those up so that people are hearing each other properly and respecting points of view. And, you know, and then stay, don't stay, agree, don't agree, that's all fine. But the problem we have is that they are basically stonewalling or not listening in the first instance, which means you can't really organize anything because the leadership team is not aligned around some key points. Gottman has some fantastic research on this. There's also, you may have seen a guy called Paul Ekman who looks at micro expressions. So these are expressions which take place in a 15th of a second. He claims they're universal. There's some controversy whether they are or they aren't, but you can see them in people. So you pick up, you know, shock, surprise, fear, contempt, all that kind of stuff, and you can see it. So it's quite interesting. Gottman is probably better, and that's to Rosanna's point about tone. You really pick up on tone as well as expression, and you also see the emotions. So you might see flush or anger or whatever. And of course, there's a reaction to that straight away. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse from Gottman are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And the research is that you can pick those things up, those essences up, just in the tone of voice. So you don't even have to hear the words, just like the dog training. You hear contempt in the tone, you know. So it doesn't, you know, you can say, I didn't say that, but we all heard that, right? So you definitely didn't say something contemptuous, but with your tone, you implied massive contempt, and now we're all defensive and we don't want to listen to you anymore. So, and then you see really interesting counterpositions. I see it in board meetings all the time, where suddenly someone really important is pretty much sulking and has closed down their ears and is stonewalling the entire group. And now we think, well, now how do we handle this agenda point? Because you're stonewalling. So we have to tease you out of that cave, make you feel better, and get you back into the convo, so that we can just get free flow of information going, which is really all we need, just flow the information. So, Rosanna, sorry.
No, I was just I think that's a really cool point, and just linking it back to emotional intelligence, then it's about how are we deliberately using that tone? Are we conscious about the tone that we're using? Because sometimes it is good to sort of deliberately use the tone, but sometimes we're not aware because emotions have, you know, risen up, and we're sometimes not aware. And so actually having a conversation, I can see you're getting upset or irritated, is that right, am I wrong, to check on whether what you're observing of that person is true. But often, especially on, as you say, Nick, the more complex and the more business critical decisions, and you know, they are emotional because they're high stakes. So are we even aware of what sort of tone of voice to use to be able to get our message across and to be able to make a decision? So I think that's the emotional intelligence point. It's about conscious tone of voice, not just the words, as David was saying.
I'll pick that back up and just say that, like, you know, there are different points we want to have a different impact with our communications as leaders. So the ability to have a high intelligence level, the social intelligence and emotional intelligence point around the board, so that you can argue out these things, so that when the message goes out, everyone is aligned around it and will support it. That's obviously fundamental. It's like a foundational stone for good communication, especially during this crisis time, where, you know, the alternatives are quite compelling. And, you know, you're thinking about what emotional impact you want to have, and also what is the to-do that you want to get across. So both those 2 points are really important. Do you want people to feel more confident you want them to stop? You know, so having that impact emotionally is really important, and getting the message through about what they should do, which again should come back to some sort of really simple kind of points, which you can then elaborate one-on-one. But as you say, Rosanna, being conscious of the emotional side of it, and therefore also understanding the tone that's needed, as well as the simple words in the message. It's complicated. To get this right, it's complicated, and it often requires argument and compromise to get the core message right. And then you've got to make sure that you hit the emotional rhythm that you're looking for with people. So anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, on a point David made at the start of this slide, with everybody being reduced to little boxes at the top of people's screens, we're taking 55% of our ability to communicate away from the body language. So now we're left in a position where if we want to convey points which are very complicated or very important, we're left trying to build on probably our tone. So we're probably all very aware of our spoken words. So we're left with 38% tone to try and work on to convey that missing chunk of body language. And you can see, I suspect it's part of body language which tells people who is thinking about speaking next, which makes it so tough to communicate in large groups on little windows. It's very hard to see who's queuing up for the next comment, because you can't sense their body language queuing up the next thing they're going to say. So I'd be really interested to see how it plays out and how people adjust and adapt to communication now that we're far more regularly practicing non-standard ways of communicating.
Great points all around, guys. I mean, the consciousness element, it can be learned, and I think we have to start with that, even whether we're in a little box in a window or whether we're in a boardroom in person, because without the consciousness of the self, you can't begin to empathize with those around you. So I think it will happen over time. I think we will learn to pick up the little cues, people in boxes on screens, in the same way that we do in boardrooms. That is, of course, if we don't end up kind of piling back into the workplace. Nick, did you want to add?
Also, just noticed Rosanna's got a hand up. So do you want to go first, Rosanna? And then I've just got a couple of comments from the audience to throw in.
Very good.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, because we're in this more arm's length sort of communication, it's interesting. I think people are a lot more polite. And obviously we facilitate, and we often facilitate around quite difficult conversations or decisions that need to be made. And an observation is that often means that people interrupt each other. And that's habitual, and I'm not, you know, often they don't know that they're doing it. It's just it's free reign. And in a way, having this separation makes people a lot more aware of when they should be communicating, what their point is, wait till the other person's finished, actually. So whilst it is more difficult, it's also showing to me that actually it's more of a polite way. There's more of an order of communication, which is just interesting.
I've got a hand up, which is unusual for us. I think this is the first on GoToMeeting. I've got a hand up from Michael Shapiro. So Michael, it's lovely to have you on. I see your hand is up. So I'm going to open your mic in a minute. So just want to give you a moment to be ready for your mic to be opened, okay? So this is your heads up, 30-second warning. I'll come back to you in just a tick. So some great points made by Mike. Again, just to the earlier point about simplicity, Mike's talking about having you know, brand guidelines, I guess copy platform, that kind of stuff, which is a really important service that marketing businesses provide to us all, really vital, and which is fundamental to organizing our communication style, and you know, picking up on the visual side of this and the tonal side of this, which is, you know, you can get great help out from good marketing advisors like Mike and his ilk to help with that. And then David Hill's just making a wonderful point about comedians, just on the sort of the body language point, which is that they can, you know, rattle on stage and make us laugh before they've said a thing. So, you know, what is that? That's special magic that people have. And I think as a leader, it's worth actually following comedians. We've worked quite closely with Emma Stroud, who's a great communicator and trainer on this. Just so great to be exposed to people like that, have that ability to just use their body and create an emotional response. It's very cool. So look, I'm going to come back to Michael Shapiro, and I'm hoping he's there. If he's not, there'll be an awkward silence, but let's see. I'm going to open his mic, and Michael, are you ready? Michael, you are unmuted, I think. Maybe I can't unmute him. I've unmuted you, Michael. Yeah, we have got the awkward silence. Michael, if you've got something you want to say, can you pile it into the questions area and we'll pick it up that way? And I'm going to put your hand down.
Good idea. Good idea. Thanks, guys. There's some really, really great points about the power of non-verbal communication coming through there. And interestingly, whilst this model was created, I think, in 1971, it's interesting how we're still using it 50 years later in the context of webinars, when webinars weren't a thing, to consider how we communicate with the outside world. So I'm going to move on to our summary, guys, because we're running up against the bumpers here. We've looked at some good and bad examples and how to do it and how not to do it and what works well. I think what's come out of it for me, and I've made some notes here, is, and I'll put this back out to you guys for a final word on this in a minute. It's about registration and confirmation. I think it's about that conscious awareness of the people that you're communicating with, a more purposeful understanding of the person that you're communicating with is absolutely key. I think especially if you need to understand their motivations and get the best out of that person. So you've really got to consider your audience, and if you can do that, ideally you do it in advance. And then you adjust your language and any terms that you use in language. You need to make sure that you're on the same level as that person if you're going to communicate in a meaningful way. And don't forget your body language and tone, because it really does play a big part in how those messages are not just delivered, but how they're registered and then understood, and how that person goes off into the world and does things with it. And I've included on the bottom of this slide, just before I come out to you guys, one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite people who I've never met but follow quite closely now. And that's: the space in between words is often more important than the words themselves. And whilst I haven't practiced that space here in a webinar because we're up against time and you wouldn't thank me for it, it really is important. And if you were to explore Mr. Eckhart Tolle and his teachings, you will see exactly what I mean about the way he speaks. An incredibly enlightening character, but the message in there is one that we can definitely take away from here. Just think about the space, not just whilst you're speaking, but beforehand. So I'm going to put this out to the guys for closing comments before we finish up the session. Does anybody want to put the icing on the cake here?
I don't know if this is icing, but I was just thinking there's lots of things we've spoken about, and actually it comes back to looking after yourself. So if you've got a really important message to deliver, making sure that you're sleeping well so that you can articulate yourself clearly, but also drinking water. David and I were talking about how drinking water before we're doing a video or a webinar is really important to get that clarity of your voice and how much confidence comes out of your voice. So there's lots of things we can all be doing, but actually going back to the basics as well, just by eating right, drinking water and sleeping well, are also just like really big hitters when being able to communicate well.
Yeah, great points. Great points. I know it makes a big difference to me. Nick?
I don't know whether we're wrapping up. I've got some questions coming and we can take them after the 45 if you wish. Michael's point has now come in, so I can just tell everyone in the group, and this resonates with me because we've been just opening up the offices and getting back in a few days a week, and I have to say my personal experience of the pleasure of being in somebody else's company is amazing. I'm not going to say whether it was unexpected, but the feeling was notable feeling of pleasure just seeing colleagues face to face and actually being around people was great. His point is that so much is lost actually in this online Teams environment that he makes sure he gets everybody in for team meetings. I guess they've got their social distancing in place, and that's a compliant kind of approach. But that's what he's doing, making sure everyone is actually physically present. And there's so much more. You having lost it for such a long time, you notice the richness of it when you get it back. It's great. There's some other points here from some of the other audience members. We can maybe pick them up in Q&A.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, I'm going to wrap the session up so that we finish on time, but we will continue after the closing slide for those that want and have time to stay on with us, and I'll thank you for doing that. I just want to let people know about the next Strategy Café, the Leader Roundtable 2, we're calling it. For those that know, we had the wonderful company of Elizabeth Bagger, Kate Cooper, Matt Earl and Giles Fuchs, all of which are leaders in their own fields. And they came on early in May in the grip of the lockdown and spoke to us about how they were managing in the crisis. And they're coming back to us at the end of July, which we're really excited about. That's going to be a great session. So I encourage people to sign up for that. And if you want to watch the previous one back, I think it's in the email that will be coming out to you in the next few days, but you can get it from our YouTube channel. So do go and have a look at it. It'll set you up for this one. So I encourage you to do that. Other than that, I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming along today and to the team for contributions and anybody that's fired in any of their questions. For those that we haven't got to, we'll get to those now. Nick's on question control, so I'll hand over to him in a second. But thanks so much. I hope it's been useful. I've very much enjoyed firstly putting it together and doing it, and hopefully it's given you something to kick off Thursday with a great start. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, David.
Right, over to you.
Great job.
For the unofficial Q&A. Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. I guess this is Strategy Cafe, an extra slice. I'm not sure how many slices we might get, but there's a good point here that we did talk about actually, but we didn't actually touch on the slides, which is about written communication and how dangerous it is. This is from David Hill, who's been listening this morning and has been contributing brilliantly with his questions and comments. And we were chatting about this the other day. It's definitely well, I think there's 2 points that we covered away, which maybe you guys can pick up on. So one is that in the spoken word, if it's unprepared, it's typically a bit of a mess. There's none of the same organization that you get when you write it down. So you don't normally have a sentence structure. I'm struggling here, so you can tell I'm trying to meta demonstrate my point. When you actually then get to writing it down, you've got more opportunity to give it, a summary and a conclusion, and to make your points succinctly. And there's some great training around that. But you can easily get it wrong, and so getting the written communication right is really super important, and can cause all sorts of problems if it's not done well. But then we were just chatting about the different channels for written communication. So, classically the Teams chat, the text, the email. There's so many channels for messages these days. I just wondered what your thoughts and points were on, from a leadership point of view, getting that stuff right.
I think you need to add in things like people's tendency to use shorthand language, abbreviations, now emojis, and words that are conjoined that aren't necessarily words. I think the whole language, the act of using language and understanding the recipient it's changed. It's changed. I'm a stickler for putting a full stop on the end of things, even if it's just a casual text to my mum or my wife or anybody. I don't know why. It's been born into me somehow now, and I can't not. If you see me do it, it's because I've slipped. And so I think in that respect, you know, punctuation plays a big part in the meaning of the message. So I think you've got to be mindful of the purpose of the message that you're actually sending out to the world, and then how it will be perceived by the recipient, and then kind of it's got to be grounded in the level of importance of what it is that you're attempting to communicate.
I think yeah, I completely agree, David, and I also think like about leadership. If you're the different written forms of communication, as Nick was saying, you get more feedback on these Slack channels, Teams chat, and in a way, as a leader, if you genuinely want feedback, writing it in an email where it's harder for people to give feedback by email than via these more iterative communication channels, then do it in another way. So you've got to think about actually how people, if you're actually asking for feedback, how is it easiest for people to feedback? Because asking for feedback at the bottom of quite a well scripted, you know, feels quite fixed, feels quite that's the way it is, and then to ask for feedback, I just think is more difficult for people. So I think you've got to think about actually how people are going to respond. It's not just okay to ask the question, you have to ask the question in the right way, in the right channel. And I think that's the real value of these chats, because you can just go, huh, question mark, and that's okay.
I've got maybe one final comment, and I think maybe we then should just wrap up for the morning and let the final listeners go. But has anyone else got to like one thing to add on this topic before I have my wrap up point?
No, go for it.
So I was just thinking more in terms of you know, the resonance around this can typically be in an email chain among senior leaders where, yeah, there's a bit of a fallout, and suddenly you get a stack up of emails round robin, and it's getting a bit hateful. So you know, so there's two sides I think to managing that, which I think is just worth talking about. So from a leadership perspective, I think it's really important to be conscious of the more difficult decisions and set up the culture of the leadership team to acknowledge consciously the danger of this, and to have a practice of communication which is better than that. So we'd set it up in a charter or something like that, which we have everyone sign up to, which is more speak to each other, less text or email each other. So the emails are great if the channel is open and communication is fine, but as soon as it gets tricky, you have to pull that down and get on a call and improve the quantity of the interaction so that people can get back to hearing proper tone of voice. If it's all gone wrong and that hate channel has kicked off and the written communication has been misinterpreted, and you start to get some of those big accusations coming in, you have besmirched a colleague, how dare you, how very dare you, all that kind of stuff, then I think you've got to step in at some point and say, look, let's take this down, let's move offline, we need to get together and just talk this out. So somebody needs to take the responsibility for you know, pulling that back into a more constructive conversation. Sometimes you need to give that a bit of time so the emotions can subside. Just as a good practice point, don't respond to those things because it just feeds the temper. Leave them for at least a day and think about your response before replying is always a good tip. And then I just think the last thing that you can do is try and find a way of reaching into that miscommunication that's going through written communication by email typically these days, and just say, look, I hope you can take this in the spirit it's intended. It's coming from a good place. What I want to try and get to in my response to this is this purpose, and then make your point. So maybe soften it up and try and, without being too preachy, bring people back into actually, maybe I've gone wrong here, and just remind them of that. So I think that kind of approach can be helpful. Yeah, and David's just sort of commenting back in here. So the key thing here is pick the phone up, and I think that's absolutely right. So we also have that in the charter. If you know, always speak in person, speak on the phone, email last, and then all other channels are just okay for you know, the chat, as long as the chat is open.
Yeah,
Thank
great point.
you for the wonderful questioning contribution from everybody this morning. I'm going to hand back to David.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Enjoyed the extra slice. It's kind of like a special bit at the end. Thanks for staying on, you guys. This recording will end up on YouTube, and we'll send it out if you want to play it back again afterwards. So thanks again. Thanks to the team. Thanks to listeners. I'm going to wrap up now.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Yes.